I think the rainy day fund gives the impression that times are so good that we can, that we can begin saving for a rainy day. It's to pretend that the rainy day is something off out there into the future that may or may not come to pass. It's to pretend that we're easily able to afford to save significant sums of money because we're financially stable. And I don't think you can equate a state to a household, but in normal households, for example, you prioritise paying the bills and putting things right before you start investing in things into the future. Yet Ireland's house is not in order. On paper, you might point to cold stats like GDP, GNP, and so on, but essentially, the measures of the health of our country are not simply possible to measure in cold finances. That is very much a bookkeeper's exercise, and Fine Gael governments in the past have been accused of really more a bookkeeping exercise rather than looking at the social component of things. We have homelessness figures for adults and children at unprecedented levels. We have housing lists that continue to grow beyond all reality, and we have public services that are crying out for strategic investment. And we're still under the unbelievable debt burden left to us by mainly, but not exclusively, by the financial institutions and bondholders in the wake of the banking collapse. So make no mistake, we still are very much in the arena of being in a rainy day in terms of what needs to be done. And of course, I'm conscious of the looming impact. How could we not be of the looming impact of Brexit and the potential fallout? Of course, we have to shield ourselves and prepare ourselves for what could be an unprecedented blow to our economy. But Minister, there are other considerations too. Very soon we'll be forced to pay cold hard cash in fines to the EU because we failed to meet our 2020 climate targets. And we're going to have to put money into meeting the targets. Instead of committing the funds to key infrastructural improvements that would help us to reach those targets, we're putting it into a rainy day fund. And because we're going to miss the 2020 targets, that means it puts us much further back in relation to meeting the 2030 targets, again with fines. Now, I asked at the Public Accounts Committee how much we would be looking at in terms of fines, and the Department of Finance economist told us that from 2021 we'd be looking at 600 million a year. Now, over 10 years, that's 6 billion. And when you start looking at the things that you could invest in, that would reduce the prospect of us paying fines. It makes sense for us to invest in. And in actual fact, it's financially prudent to do that if you look at the things in the round. Ireland has a huge infrastructural deficit, and I think there's no argument that it's holding the country back. If you look at countries like, for example, the Nordic countries, why is there an equivalent kind of investment by foreign direct investment in those countries? They don't have a low corporation tax rate. So what do they have that is equal to, do they have that is attractive? They have good education and training, they have fantastic services, and they have excellent infrastructure. So essentially, you can do it a different way, but you must invest. Ireland, as I say, Ireland has huge infrastructural deficits. Our continued lack of investment in basic services means our people are constantly waiting on hospital trolleys, waiting on never-ending housing and health waiting lists, waiting on at bus stops and train stops. And I'm also on the Transport Committee, and for example, if you want to look at things from the point of view, transport is one of the components of climate, and in terms of the bill we could end up with. It takes 5 years in the lead-in time to order and have a train delivered, and we now have a situation where we have overcrowded trains, making it unattractive for people to use them at peak times when we need to get people to use them, and make it an attractive proposition. More people in cars, and there's a never-ending round. Instead of making that kind of investment, which makes not only sense in terms of the cost of congestion, in terms of productivity and accident rates and all of the rest of it, but indeed these fines. That kind of investment is something that brings a return. So obviously, purely on a theoretical level, an emergency fund makes sense. It can be set aside with boom time taxes, such as we did experience in the last year. We experienced a very large extra amount came in corporation tax. It wasn't set aside for it wasn't set aside for the for capital projects. It was actually just went into the health budget, and it's the very opposite of what the government preaches to the rest of us about the kind of economics that you see as not being very prudent, but that's exactly what happened. The reality is that the theoretical view fails to take account of the value of spending to save for short, medium and long term. For example, if we look at the housing assistance payment, 40,000 households, or in excess of 40,000 households, are being supported with housing assistance payments. Private landlords are getting the benefit of that. Because we haven't built house, we haven't made that investment, and some of that could have been from the European Investment Bank. It doesn't always have to be from national coffers, and there was a lot more money in that fund that we could have leveraged, even during the really tough times straight after the crash. But if we had invested in a lot more direct bills, it would have had an impact on the cost of rents generally, because the capacity issue would have been dealt with. That feeds directly into the cost of living, which is unsustainably high, and in parts of this city, for example, it's just not possible for people on ordinary or reasonably good wages to actually live in rented properties, because they're constantly the rents are constantly raising, and that's because there's a capacity issue. While there is most definitely a role for the private sector in building houses, but there is also a much greater role for for public sector involvement, and it has a direct bearing on the price of rents. And I can't get my head around why there's been such resistance to that. The cost of living continues to rise because of the lack of investments that I've talked about. And a useful topic, for example, in relation to the health services, sláinte care. By investing in the infrastructure that allows for your primary health care centres, you can actually reduce the demand on the public hospital aspect, which is a much more expensive way of delivering health care. So it is about spending now to save. That would be the approach that we feel is needed. In the absence of that kind of a system in terms of healthcare, people find themselves forking out for example, private health insurance. I come across pensioners who are trying to struggle to pay their private health insurance, terrified that they'll get sick. They may only need to be, if there was a primary health care centre beside them, that they were monitored, for example, for things like diabetes or illnesses like that. A much more efficient way of dealing, and a much cheaper way, and just a satisfactory way of dealing with healthcare for some cohorts of illnesses. If you're looking at it obviously with a colder economic eye, it's clear to see that the higher cost of living in Ireland is making it very unattractive and it will continue to become unattractive for investment, whether it's domestic or foreign direct investment, because of the cost of living and so on and so forth. As I said, the Nordic countries are a very good example of where the kind of investment that is needed would be a benefit for a sustainable growth into the future. We've also expressed serious concerns as to whether the fund could ever actually be used. The Minister has linked the fund to a catastrophic event, making it more like a very expensive insurance policy, as opposed to a fund for maybe capital investment as the need arises. Of course, and that can be very useful if there's a downturn, that you have a fund there for capital investment where you can keep people employed and you can actually add to your economy in terms of the level of growth. But of course, we accept that it is prudent not to rely on corporation tax receipts or development levies, the one-off booms for ongoing revenue, but it doesn't mean that the revenue from a boom in those kind of taxes couldn't be used to fund infrastructural projects as the need arises. We don't believe that a rainy day fund is an appropriate approach, and instead the Social Democrats have proposed the creation of an infrastructure contingency fund, which at least is descriptive about what it can be used for, rather than a catastrophic event which, you know, it's not clear how it could be leveraged. Such a fund would be held in reserve for key infrastructural projects and made available for capital projects in areas such as health, housing, energy, transport, on the principle of if you invest now, you will save, by virtue of the fact of the like of the climate aspects, or housing, or the like of sláinte care that I've already highlighted. Where we have an opportunity to address key infrastructural deficits, and doing so save significant costs in the medium and the longer term, and reduce the cost of living for people. The more the cost of living rises, the more there will be demands on for wage increases, salary increases, and there's kind of a never-ending round of problems if that was the case. And like we did have a fund in the past. It was called the Pension Reserve Fund. We had, I think, 67 million or something in it, or was it? Sorry, it was way more than that. It was we had a very significant amount of money, and that's because we do have a pension time bomb. That was raided. To predominantly bail out the banks. We have a national debt that is in the stratosphere. It's over 200 billion, and essentially, if we're going to sustain that debt, if we're going to pay that debt off, we have to have a vibrant economy. That vibrant economy depends on us having housing that people can afford, not raising our cost of living so as that it's unsustainable, not incurring debts like we will incur in relation to not investing, to make sure we don't have a debt in relation to our climate obligations. It's prudent to look at it in the round, and I believe, and we believe, that this has been looked at in a very silo-based way, and we think that we could be putting this fund out of reach when it could be used in a way that we would end up with a much more sustainable country and economy. Thank you.